to introduce Pat Swan, who's going to be facilitating the discussion. She's a she's a senior program officer at the New York Community Trust, our partner here, and her grant making covers community development, civic affairs, and technical assistance. She has decades of experience in neighborhood-based strategies for equitable development in New York City. She's also on LIST New York City's local advisory committee, and she's been a key supporter of the work you've seen here today. So much of the content that you've seen reflects her deep thinking and partnership on this endeavor to tackle issues of displacement and equitable development here in New York City. So thank you, Pat, for your support, and take it away to the final part of this day. The hardest part is bringing it all together.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I understand that we have a hard stop at 4:30 to accommodate another event. So that gives us about 22 minutes or so to wrap this up. I had this brilliant synthesis of the entire day, all prepared, but I think in the interest of time, I also have about 32 questions that have just been handed to me that people have filled out and emailed. So I'm going to just say two quick things before I just select one of the 2 or 3 of the questions out of the pile. I think we'll probably only have time for 2 or 3 questions. So one thing I want to say for certain, and I'll speak really fast, is thank you, thank you, thank you. The people who put this together did an amazing job. And so I have to name them, and so not each individual, obviously, but I have to give a shout out to the Furman Center for Real Estate and Urban Policy. They've been amazing in helping put this together and in hosting us in this wonderful space. The Community Affairs Office of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York has been very critical in putting this together and helping us put the panels together. And the LISC New York City office has been amazing. And I have to say a special thank you to Eva Alagood, who is really the glue that helped pull all this together. Thank you, Eva. And so the other thing I'll say real quickly before I pull a question out is that we understand that this is obviously the beginning of a really complicated conversation. This whole issue of displacement is really difficult. It has overlays of race, it has overlays of income and equity, and it's just a really tough conversation. I think we've made a serious dent in trying to lift up some possible fresh looks at policies that might impact it. But I think we obviously have to figure out ways to continue the conversation. We are planning to put up a website for this conference that will be one of the vehicles for that ongoing conversation. There will be a follow-up email in your inboxes with a link to that website. And the New York City LISC office is also committing to finding some way to continue the conversation. They will all have a heart attack if we commit right now to doing this again, but some smaller scale version of this conversation we know is going to be in the works. So some of the common themes, just real quickly, the overlay of the importance of community engagement and that is meaningful. And obviously a part of that is also a clarity about values. When we say equitable development, that implies a certain set of values. And we need to be really clear about that. There was some conversation about that, but obviously that's an ongoing one. There was also a lot of, there were at least 24 or more very clear and specific policy possibilities, solutions. Some that dealt with regulating the market, some that dealt with harnessing the market, some that dealt with limiting the market. There's all kinds of versions of that. There was a very sort of deep drill panel of academic researchers that talked about ways you can collect data to document what's happening as well as set up early warning systems. We just had an all-star government panel who talked about some really interesting and in some cases maybe somewhat controversial or provocative statements. We also had an all-star New York City panel that was equally provocative. And I think instead of me continuing to try and synthesize all of the amazing conversation that we've had today, I'm going to just pull a question out of the pile here. And I've been told that many of our panelists have agreed to stay to address these questions. So my first question that I'm pulling out is addressed to Commissioner Bean and Kapir. Where is she? Ah, okay. And our Executive Director of the City Planning Department. You're being asked to address how the proposed BQX will affect displacement along the route for low-income communities. And maybe you should explain the BQX. It's the proposed trolley route along the waterfront of Brooklyn Queens waterfront. So, and I'm going to try to get to 2 or 3 questions, so I guess if we could hold it to a couple of minutes. How will it affect displacement for low-income communities, not NYCHA residents? I suppose the question is, will it create displacement or not?
So, I have the good fortune of being in charge of affordable housing, not the BQX. But of course, any project like the BQX has to go through an environmental review process and a great deal of process, and those concerns and those issues will certainly be discussed at length.
I would add that, our hope is that it will actually start to connect neighborhoods that have historically been not served with good transit options and provide ways for people to, get to jobs more easily. I mean, I don't see sort of a displacement connection as much as I see a connection with bringing communities to, jobs, bringing communities closer to other modes of transportation. But I mean, it's a process, it's just started. Even the route is not fully determined yet, so it's premature to say what it will do in terms of.
Yeah, it's a few $1 billion away from being more than a concept. So, another question. If the city, I believe this is generally directed, if the city had policy tools to make housing affordable for lower income people, say people making $20,000 a year, would low-income neighborhoods be more supportive of rezonings? Maybe to give the commissioners a break, we might direct that at one of the community development folks that are actively engaged in some of the rezoning processes. Okay. Do you want to weigh in? No?
Yes, and that's one of the reasons why it's so critical to also be bringing the federal government into this conversation, right? Okay. We have not had the kind of support on rental assistance vouchers that we used to be able to depend upon. We have not had the kind of support in all kinds of ways from the federal and state governments that we depended upon. So those vouchers are absolutely critical. The city is one of the only cities in the United States that has provided its own voucher program through the LINK vouchers, but it is an enormous, enormous amount of money, an enormous commitment that is really the responsibility of the federal government.
I'll just add that really almost the only time during the presidential campaign that at least the 2 Democratic candidates talked about depth of affordability and increasing federal resources to affordable housing was while they were campaigning here in New York. Yeah, I mean, they each took a visit to public housing. They each actually substantially strengthened their housing platforms. Bernie didn't actually have one. He put it up on the web when he came in. And Hillary's was good and got meaningfully stronger in the time she spent here. But making that real is going to take a lot more work. But we certainly can't get to the depth of affordability we're talking about without those resources, without more Section 8 or Housing Trust Fund.
And I would qualify that with existing residents. I actually just had lunch with someone in my community who's low income, lived in the community. She's a homeowner, she's African American, and talked to her about getting rid of a single family zone and allowing duplexing and triplexing. And the only condition that she had was that people who wanted to own in the community had the ability to do it. So I think it needs to be place-based.
Okay, and while the microphone is at this table, we were lucky to have East Coast, West Coast, and Midwest representation today. So I have one that's directed, I think, broadly as well. We have eminent domain as a planning tool to acquire land to be used for public good. Are any cities using it to bring land into public ownership and use it for low-cost housing?
I can respond for Boston. I think we are legally limited in that we cannot acquire land unless it's for municipal purpose, and currently under Massachusetts state law, affordable housing is not a municipal purpose. We have, we're considering whether or not we can change that. But in the interim, we can certainly provide funding to community development associations, community development corporations, and land trusts to acquire affordable housing with city-sponsored resources to meet those goals, and that's certainly an active part of our acquisition strategy. So yes.
Any other?
I'll just say there are conversations underway of things that went through eminent domain for building hospitals and other urban renewal projects that are now at the end of their viable life. And so people are wanting those properties that are going to be abandoned to go back into affordable housing and to try to have some right of return for people who were eminent domained out. I know there's some conversations in your community about that, but definitely in California, that is a process underway.
All right, here is another one that is sort of a multi-city themed question. It starts clearly, organizing was a key political lever in each neighborhood, but in Chicago, where the alderman has zoning authority, there was greater leverage. In New York City, neighborhood plans have very little, if any, teeth. Could the panelists comment on that? And what does that say about what needs to change in New York City?
I mean, I won't answer for New York City because you know your environment better, but I'll say that the way this political dynamic is shifting in California is through electoral politics, that in high-cost cities that are a majority of renters, you have pretty good leverage for getting policies that protect renters and do other things. And we've seen a lot of policy change underway in Oakland, and it's the very first time that we've had labor standing with the affordable housing community. And the labor unions in Northern California, their members' top concern when being polled is about being displaced from their housing, and that's the first time we've ever seen that. And having labor at the table when you're talking about affordable housing makes council members pay a lot more attention.
So I would say, speaking from Portland, the neighborhood level of control is a double-edged sword, right? Because we have neighborhood associations, it's similar to Seattle, that have a sort of official place in government in participating in planning process. They are very dominated by homeowners. Some of them don't even provide notice to renters living in their neighborhoods because they use a notification system that only goes to homeowners and owners of rental property. And so a lot of the single family exclusion and NIMBYism can also be expressed through those neighborhood associations. And it's been a focus of community organizing to kind of both try to get into official neighborhood association positions like land use chair, and also to try to decenter them in the planning process from having that being the only community engagement voice that has an official representation in the process.
Well, I know the question implied that the neighborhoods have no teeth, but I would say that in New York, we have a pretty sophisticated system that has layers of timed levels of input and so forth. It's a challenge, though. It's a very sophisticated and complicated and technical. Community organizations are called upon to review and analyze environmental impact statements and so forth and so on, and it's not an easy process. So I'll move on to another question. We are learning that, and this is also generally directed, we are learning that much displacement may be indirect, including a ratchet effect of not being able to return to a gentrifying neighborhood. What do we know about who leaves and why. In particular, how does race factor into this? So if any of the academic folks are around, or if any of our colleagues from Furman Center would be interested in responding to that.
Hi, I can just add to something I didn't mention earlier, was that one of the findings where we're tracking people of where they're living is that the people moving from predominantly black neighborhoods are moving to much worse neighborhoods than where they started relative to those moving from predominantly, or from not predominantly black neighborhoods. And so we don't have the race of the people that we're tracking, but I think that suggests that people who are minority residents who are being displaced are moving to worse off neighborhoods and getting the low end of the deal, the lowest end of the deal of people getting displaced.
Anyone else? Okay. All right, I'm getting more questions in here than I anticipated. This is good. What research is being done on the influence of global capital on hyper-speculation in local housing markets and displacement of low-income residents, and what measures are being taken to mitigate this? Yes, sir? Identify yourself, please.
I'm Oscar Bello. I'm a reporter for Next City, and that's an online publication. I've covered many of you in the room. It was an honor. Some of you multiple times, council member. There's a bill going through the House and Senate right now. It actually passed both houses, and it has to go through conference and then go through again and then get signed by the president. It's probably not going to happen this year, but anyway, it's a bill to end anonymous shell companies. Anonymous shell companies are how global capital can do what it does in Manhattan and Brooklyn and the Bronx. It's how landlords can do what they do to these buildings. If the bills, they have to be reconciled, but one bill says the states would keep the databases, one bill says the feds would keep the databases. Believe it or not, the biggest banks have signed a letter to support this bill because the banks are scared of laundering money for terrorists and Vladimir Putin and whoever else. But it would also affect these issues because those databases would be public and it would be available for use by state attorneys general, legal aid society, urban justice center, and other advocates, even council members who would like to look up in their districts who are the landlords that are buying all these buildings and establishing all these anonymous shell companies to buy the buildings and then vacate the tenants. So anyway, those bills are moving through House and Senate, and if you'd like to know more, I'd be happy to tell you more.
All right, thank you. All right, I think we've got time for one more, and then Sam Marks will come up and wrap this all up. So a lot of advocates criticize how the city evaluates indirect residential displacement in environmental impact statements. Is it time to revise the technical manual to require a more in-depth analysis of a project's potential effects on indirect displacement? Is this one for the... I'm answering.
Oh my God, right.
Thanks, Brad. Thanks for facilitating that.
So the technical manual and the EIS, which, I mean, the EIS is a very, very technical document. It is a disclosure document. The methodologies that are laid out in the technical manual are sort of, none of them are perfect. I think particularly when it comes to, but this is a disclosure. This is not that, this is really to let decision makers know this is what the environmental impact is saying about a certain action, and it doesn't stop them from adopting something that has a lot of impacts or not adopting something that may have no impact. So it's merely disclosure. As far as displacement goes and whether it's direct or indirect displacement, I mean, as sort of Vicki and I both sort of stated at our panel, this administration is very focused on the concerns about displacement, whether those be in the context of a rezoning action or otherwise occurring throughout the city. And the mayor is very focused, and HPD and others in the administration are very, very focused on addressing that issue regardless, whatever the EIS does or doesn't say, or whatever our methodologies do or don't say about those. And so, you know, I think there are things that the EIS can disclose, but there are things that we know are the right things to do regardless, and we are doing them.
Okay, so I guess it would be fair to say, would it be fair to say that your recommendation would be don't focus so much on revising the technical manual for the EIS, because that's, at the end of the day, that's not really the essential document that's going to determine any kind of anti-displacement protection that might be built into an action on zoning or any other neighborhood plan?
I would just say, be careful what you wish for when it comes to EIS documents.
Okay, all right. Okay, I think that's all that we have time for, and I am really proud to and privileged to be a part of this room. This is a really impressive group. Thank you very, very much.
And thank you, Pat. Pat, you had the absolute toughest job of the day, so thank you for leading us in that discussion. I just want to close out. First of all, just thanks again to all of our sponsors, NYU Furman Center, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York Community Trust, and the Revson Foundation. Thank you for your support in helping us pull this whole thing together. So I am not here with List New York City's 10-point plan for how we move forward and the policy recommendations that are the silver bullet. There is a lot dangling here from this conversation, and that was by design. You know, there are some really interesting technical questions that came up today about, you know, do we have the data infrastructure and the right research agenda to be able to get our heads around the displacement conversation and understand those dynamics? And there are also some significant sort of values conversations about how and why, and the question of equitable development, and whether we have the right framework, you know, the conversation between Brad and Vicky about, does that framework exist and has it been articulated? So these are all big questions, and you know, I think we are committed to continuing to work these conversations, and I really believe that this is the room of people and the folks live streaming who can really work with us to work these. As we were sitting and watching the RSVP list come in, we were just really thrilled to have all of you guys here today, and just, you know, a promise that this is not the end of the conversation, it's just the beginning, and watch this space to figure out what form that's going to take. Follow us on Twitter, watch for the updates to the website. We'll be posting content, reflections as we go, and please do also use the email address there to provide feedback, thoughts, reflections, and we'll think of some structured way to do that as well. So thank you, everybody. We are actually out by 4:30 for the next event. Thank you guys so much for coming. To be continued.